In the autumn of 58 AD, the Roman army, under the command of Corbulo, advanced toward Artaxata, the heart of the Armenian Kingdom. To protect the legions from sudden and scattered attacks by the Parthian light cavalry, Corbulo moved his troops in hollow square formation. The Romans, like a moving fortress, steadily approached the walls of Artaxata. Facing them stood Tiridates, king of Armenia. Until that moment, he had avoided direct confrontation with the Romans, but now, to defend his capital, he had summoned his forces and arrayed them on the plain opposite the Roman army, a scene that instinctively evoked memories of the Battle of Carrhae, whose bitter recollection still haunted the Romans. The fate of Armenia now rested in the hands of the legionaries and cataphracts. By the end of the day, it would be clear who would be the master of Armenia. At the start of the 50s of the 1st century AD, tensions between Rome and Parthia escalated once again. Vologas's involvement in Armenia and the appointment of his brother Tiridates as king of the territory provoked deep dissatisfaction among the Romans. In response, Corbulo, an experienced commander who had previously achieved significant victories in Germania, was appointed as legate of the two provinces of Cappadocia and Galatia to counter the Parthian threat. Initially, both sides attempted to resolve the dispute through diplomacy and negotiations, but after the failure of talks in late 57 AD, war between the two powers became inevitable. It seemed that a full-scale war between Rome and Parthia would begin in the spring of 58 AD, but suddenly, alarming news reached Vologases. Apparently, in the absence of the king, a major rebellion had erupted in the province of Hyrcania. Vologases was forced, during the early days of the war, to leave Armenia with the bulk of his forces, leaving only a small number of Parthian cavalry under Tiridates' command. From this point onward, Tiridates had to mostly rely on the Armenian forces under his command to confront the Roman threat. With Parthian troops withdrawn, Tiridates' position as king of Armenia had become precarious. Consequently, he launched a campaign against domestic opponents and pro-Roman Armenian nobles to prevent them from assisting the Romans in the event of Corbulo's advance. The Parthian Armenian forces attacked territories controlled by pro-Roman nobles, clearing the way. During this campaign, a detachment of Parthian troops accidentally encountered the Roman camp. Between 55 and 58 AD, Corbulo had established several forts along the Armenian frontier. Auxiliary forces stationed in these forts were under the command of a primus pilus named Patius Orphetus, tasked with the protection of the encampments. As Corbulo did not want to initiate the conflict, he remained with the main force in the camp, awaiting any movement from the Armenians. In the spring of 58 AD, a group of advancing Parthian Armenian cavalry carelessly approached too close to the Roman camp. The camp sentries identified them, and Patius Orphetus immediately informed Corbulo of the enemy's presence and requested permission to engage. Corbulo reluctantly denied the request, ordering that no action be taken until reinforcements. When several squadrons of auxiliary cavalry from nearby forts joined Orphetus, they encouraged him to pursue and attack the Armenians. Orphetus, despite having received Corbulo's explicit order to avoid pursuing the enemy, was carried away by the enthusiasm and encouragement of his horsemen and charged toward the Armenians. The Armenians reacted the moment they saw the Roman cavalry approaching. They were far more prepared than Aufitus had assumed. Using the famous Parthian shot, the light cavalry feigned retreat while loosing arrows at the advancing Romans. Just as had happened to Publius Crassus at Carrhae, the Romans had fallen into a Parthian-Armenian trap. Once the Roman cavalry had been drawn far enough away from the camp, the Parthian-Armenian light horse suddenly halted their retreat and positioned themselves on both flanks of the Roman force. At that very moment, emerging from the clouds of dust, rising across the battlefield, heavily armored cavalry, trained for close combat, charged directly into the Roman ranks, cutting down large numbers of them. A fierce clash erupted between the cavalry of both sides. With every passing moment, more Romans, trapped within the encirclement of the mounted archers, were thrown from their horses onto the ground. Realizing the battle had turned against him, Aufitus immediately ordered a retreat. Only a handful of terrified Roman cavalrymen managed to escape alive. The newly arrived reinforcements, upon seeing their fleeing and panic-stricken comrades, likewise lost their morale and fled the field. In this first encounter, the Parthians succeeded in securing a victory, however small. The war had not begun well for the Romans. Even this limited defeat at the opening of the campaign proved disastrous for Corbulo's inexperienced army. Furious at the disobedience of the Primus Pilus under his command, Corbulo harshly reprimanded Aufitus and the other officers responsible for the disaster. While these events unfolded at the Roman frontier forts, Tiridates continued his campaign against Armenian nobles aligned with Rome. To support these allies, Corbulo marched out of the camp with his forces. Tiridates, who likely lacked sufficient strength to confront the Roman army directly after Vologas's withdrawal, adopted guerrilla warfare instead of open battle. He divided his forces into smaller detachments to strike both the positions of pro-Roman nobles and the Roman army itself. The Parthian-Armenian forces launched a campaign based on plundering, rapid raids, and scattered devastation against regions under Roman influence. Based on his experiences in Germania, Corbulo anticipated that Tiridates would attempt a sudden, large-scale assault. For this reason, he immediately advanced with his entire army to prevent the plundering of Rome's Armenian allies. Yet the Parthian-Armenian forces consistently avoided large-scale engagements, retreating whenever the main Roman army approached. Frustrated by the absence of a decisive battle and the inconclusive nature of the fighting, Corbulo realized that he had underestimated the enemy's tactics. He therefore adapted himself to the new conditions. To counter Tiridates, Corbulo decided to imitate his methods of warfare. He too divided his army into smaller columns and detachments to operate independently against Armenian Parthian raiding parties. In this way, the Romans were able to cover a wider area and protect the cities and territories of their allies from the enemy's scattered raids and plundering attacks. In addition, Corbulo sought assistance from Rome's allied kings in order to increase the pressure on Tiridates. He ordered King Antiochus of Commagene to invade Armenia from the southwest, while Pharasmanes, king of Iberia, eager to demonstrate his loyalty to the Romans, launched an incursion into Armenia from the north. Corbulo also succeeded in securing the support of the Moschi tribe, who inhabited the northern and eastern regions of Armenia, persuading them to take action against Tiridates. Tiridates suddenly found himself threatened from several directions. He immediately dispatched an envoy to Corbulo, demanding an explanation as to why he was still being attacked, despite the fact that the hostages requested during the earlier negotiations had already been handed over. He emphasized that his brother, Vologases, had refrained from attacking the Roman forces in the hope of finding a diplomatic solution, before reminding the Romans of Parthia's victories in past wars. Corbulo's response was firm and direct. He insisted that Armenia belonged to the Roman Empire, and that if Tiridates wished to preserve his authority and title, he must submit himself to the Roman emperor. The two sides agreed to hold a direct meeting in order to resolve their differences. However, Corbulo ignored Tiridates' request that he appear with only 1,000 cavalrymen and without armor as a gesture of good faith. Instead, he assembled all his forces beneath a single eagle standard, creating the impression that he had arrived with only one legion. When Tiridates saw the vast number of Roman troops, he refused to approach. After several hours of fruitless negotiations, darkness fell, and both sides returned to their camps. Tiridates decided to exploit the cover of night and maneuver around the Roman forces in order to strike their supply lines, which were sustained through the route from Trebizond. This tactic had proven effective for the Parthians in the past. During Mark Antony's campaign, the Parthians had managed, through similar methods, to destroy Roman supply lines and siege equipment, trapping Antony's army in Atropatene. This time, however, Corbulo had taken precautions with full awareness of that historical precedent. He had established a chain of forts and fortifications along the mountainous route leading to the Black Sea and assigned troops to guard the supply caravans. As a result, Tiridates' attempt to sever Roman logistics ended in failure. In response, Corbulo decided to strike against the fortresses and major cities that supported Tiridates, both to draw the enemy away from his supply lines and perhaps in the hope of forcing them into a decisive, large-scale battle. By adopting such a strategy, Corbulo pursued three objectives. First, these fortresses and the surrounding territories could serve as ideal refuges for Parthian-Armenian guerrilla forces, allowing them to retreat behind their walls after attacking enemy positions. Second, the financial resources of Tiridates' army were sustained through taxes and plunder stored within the treasuries of these strongholds. Third, and most importantly, the capture of these fortresses would weaken Tiridates' political prestige and authority. A king incapable of protecting his subjects could hardly expect their loyalty. Before long, Corbulo identified three major fortresses as targets for attack. He personally marched with his army toward Volandum, while his two commanders, Flaccus and Capito, advanced against two smaller and less significant strongholds. The Roman legionaries advanced toward the walls of Volandum in the famous Testudo formation. The volleys of arrows and sling stones launched by the Armenian defenders proved ineffective against them, and before long, the fortress fell without losses. The city was plundered, and by Corbulo's order, all adult males were put to death. The remaining inhabitants, including women and children, were divided among the Roman troops as slaves. Corbulo's message was unmistakable. Anyone who stood in the path of Rome would be punished severely, while those who surrendered would receive mercy and clemency. After securing this victory, Corbulo concentrated his forces and advanced toward Artaxata, the capital of the Armenian Kingdom. News of the fall and plundering of Volandum had such an impact upon the people of Armenia that many surrendered to the Romans without resistance. Before long, Corbulo and his men reached Artaxata. Tiridates, determined to defend his capital, summoned all his forces and arrayed them before the gates of the city. By the autumn of 58 AD, the Roman forces under Corbulo, through a swift and successful campaign, had managed to drive back Tiridates' Armenian Parthian army and were now approaching the Armenian capital. Since the only bridge across the Aras lay near Artaxata's walls, Corbulo chose to cross at a wider and shallower section of the river to ensure the safety of his troops. Tiridates, who had until then avoided a major battle, was now compelled to gather his army and prepare to face the Romans in defense of his capital. Tiridates positioned his army on an open plain, suitable for cavalry maneuvers along the path of the Roman advance, intending to make full use of his mounted troops. Corbulo, whose army had been reinforced by the 10th Legion Fretensis, immediately ordered his men to form a hollow square as soon as he sighted the Armenian Parthian forces, a defensive formation highly effective against cavalry assaults. The 10th Legion Fretensis formed the front side of the square, while the right flank was held by the 3rd Legion Gallica and the left by the 6th Legion Ferrata. The wagons carrying supplies and siege equipment were placed at the center of the formation, while the rear side was guarded by cavalry forces. Corbulo had given them strict orders not to abandon their positions under any circumstances and to refrain from pursuing the enemy. Other cavalry units, together with archers, were deployed along the flanks of the army. The Roman host advanced toward Artaxata like a moving fortress. Tiridates understood well that a direct assault against the tightly packed legionary ranks would amount to suicide. Therefore, drawing inspiration from the Battle of Carrhae, he ordered his light cavalry forward. Their objective was to gradually encircle the Roman army and harass it with long-range missile fire. However, Corbulo's army possessed one crucial advantage absent from Crassus's force: auxiliary archers and missile troops capable of countering the Parthian mounted archers and preventing them from achieving complete superiority in ranged combat. The Parthian cavalry advanced, but carefully maintained a safe distance from the Roman lines to avoid coming within range of their archers. The mounted archers occasionally rode closer, loosed their arrows, and then swiftly wheeled away. At times, they even deliberately appeared disorganized and chaotic, as though a frightened army was in retreat. Tiridates likely hoped that under the pressure of such attacks, the Romans would break formation and pursue the Parthian Armenian horsemen. Yet the strict discipline Corbulo had imposed upon the army after the disaster of Orphetus prevented such a reaction. None of the Roman units dared disobey orders and leave their ranks. Only a young decurion, eager for glory and renown, charged toward the Parthian mounted archers, but before long he was cut down beneath a storm of arrows. The incident once again reminded the Romans that the Parthians remained deadly enemies. As darkness fell, Tiridates, having failed to lure Corbulo into a mistake, was ultimately forced to recall his forces. Corbulo encamped on the spot and intended to seize the city through a surprise attack during the night, believing that Tiridates and his army had withdrawn inside Artaxata. Yet shortly afterward, scouts reported that the Parthian prince had retreated to a distant position. The road before the Roman army now lay open. As the sun rose over Armenia, Corbulo advanced toward Artaxata, and the city surrendered without resistance. As the Roman soldiers celebrated their victory, they shouted Nero's name as Imperator. Corbulo most likely spent the winter of 58 AD behind the walls of Artaxata. With the arrival of spring in 59 AD, the Roman army marched once more. Before departing the city, Corbulo ordered the inhabitants of Artaxata to evacuate. He then commanded that the city be burned and its walls demolished. Corbulo lacked sufficient forces to hold Artaxata, and if he abandoned it, the city might once again fall into Parthian hands. For this reason, he preferred to destroy it entirely rather than allow the enemy to make use of it. The next destination of the Roman army was Tigranokerta, the second capital of Armenia. During the advance toward Tigranokerta, the Romans encountered little resistance. Only several fortresses and a number of Armenian tribes resisted, and they too were crushed with severity. Most cities surrendered before the power of the legions. Marching through the harsh, mountainous terrain of Armenia, while their provisions steadily dwindled, the Roman soldiers eventually reached Tigranokerta. At first, the inhabitants resolved to resist and closed the gates before the Roman army. However, when the severed head of a captured Armenian nobleman was hurled into the city by a ballista and by chance landed directly in the midst of the war council, the terror caused by the incident compelled the people of Tigranokerta to surrender and open their gates to the Romans. The inhabitants presented Corbulo with a golden crown, and in return, he granted clemency to the city and forbade any harm from being inflicted upon it. Following this victory, the Roman forces continued their advance and captured Legerda, the last Armenian fortress still resisting the Roman army. Corbulo spent the winter in Tigranokerta. Around the same time, envoys from Hyrcania came to meet him and proposed cooperation and alliance with Rome. They also informed the Romans of military preparations by Tiridates' forces in Atropatene for another assault on Armenia. With the beginning of 60 AD, Tiridates once again attempted to reclaim Armenia. However, Corbulo, having already been informed of his movements, had dispatched an advance force under the command of Verulanus toward the Armenian frontier. Tiridates soon encountered them, and when he learned that Corbulo himself was approaching behind them with the main army, he withdrew from Armenia. Thus, Armenia once again fell under Roman control. Tigranes, son of the king of Cappadocia and a descendant of Herod the Great, was appointed by Rome as the new king of Armenia. Corbulo left behind 1,000 legionaries, along with 3 cohorts of auxiliary infantry and 2 cavalry ali to support Tigranes. He himself then marched towards Syria in order to succeed the late Quadratus as legate of the province. Corbulo's campaign of 58 to 60 AD ended in success for the Romans, bringing Armenia once again under Roman influence. Nevertheless, both Corbulo and Emperor Nero understood that this victory could not truly be secured until they had faced the main army of the Parthian Empire. In 61 AD, King Vologases, having successfully suppressed the Hyrcanian revolt, marched into Armenia to confront the Romans. In the next episode, we will cover Vologases' campaign in Armenia and the Battle of Randea, which ultimately determined the fate of the war.